Good evening and welcome back for the latest edition of the Four Score Speaker Series. You likely know me by now. I'm Jamie Stout, the Director of Membership for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. We hope this finds you well and safe at home. When we started this virtual programming in May, we didn't know what to expect, but you guys keep turning out and asking for more, so we're going to keep going. We appreciate the continued support of the foundation and our mission of providing cultural and educational programming in conjunction with the ALPLM and preserving Mr. Lincoln's legacy. Tonight, we are joined by Jason Emerson. Jason is an independent historian and journalist living in Syracuse, New York. He's the author or editor of 7 different books about Abraham Lincoln and his family, including the one we'll be discussing tonight, Mary Lincoln for the Ages. Jason has published numerous articles and book reviews in both scholarly and popular publications and appeared on Book TV, the American History TV, the History Channel, and more. He's worked as a National Park Service Ranger at Lincoln Home National Historic Site, Gettysburg National Military Park, and the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, the Arch in St. Louis. He's also a costume interpreter at the Genesee Country Museum.
That was only for one summer,
in New York. He's a professional journalist and a freelance writer. So, and as always, we will take your questions and answers throughout the night. You can just put those in the question and answer box below. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Christian McWhirter, the ALPLM Lincoln historian, and Jason.
Thank you, Jamie. I want to echo what Jamie just said about how fortunate we are and how grateful we are that you all keep tuning into these, because if it hasn't come across, I have a load of fun doing these, and so it's really been enjoyable for me. It's been a great opportunity for me to interview some scholars that one of the funny things about working at a museum like I do is when I meet these people, or if we communicate, if we correspond via email or whatever, I rarely actually get to sit down with them and talk about like Lincoln and history. Like we're talking business, or I'm taking them on to, or we're at a conference. And Jason Emerson is a perfect example of that. Jason Emerson is someone whose work I use constantly in my job. I'm constantly referencing his work for both my own stuff and for people who contact me with questions. And I've bumped into Jason probably a handful of times now, but it's always been a quick thing, or we've been at somebody else's lecture or something like that. I've never actually had the time to just sit down with Jason. So that was a long intro. But today, I think we'll talk to Jason about a lot of things. The book, Mary Lincoln for the Ages, is the main reason I invited him today. And I want to say this book, too, is going to be a extremely valuable reference tool for me and the library. In fact, I want you to know, Jason, before I introduce you, that one of the things I recently did was I asked our reference librarian, Megan Harmon, we have like a Lincoln research shelf in the reading room of like books that we can direct people to that they don't even have to pull from the collection that they can use as reference tool. And I said, this book needs to be on that shelf. So,
thank you.
So we'll talk about more detail, but yeah, first of all, Jason, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here, buddy.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me. No, it's always fun. I can talk about Lincoln constantly up here in upstate New York. Lincoln's not as big of a topic of conversation as you might expect, or it is in Illinois. So it's nice. And my family long ago stopped listening. So, it's fun.
yeah, I'm in the same boat. Yeah, I think my wife used to, when I'd give a talk, my wife used to come and all that. Yeah,
right.
So let's talk just before we get into the book. So how, if you don't mind dating yourself, how many years now have you been researching and writing about the Lincoln family?
Wow, let's see. I started when I was 19, actually. I was, my first time at the Lincoln Home, I was a Student Conservation Association volunteer, which it's an organization that still exists. So it's volunteering in the national parks. I did the same exact job as the park rangers, but I just had a different title. So yeah, so I was 19 and now I'm 45. So what, 26 years now. So yeah, it's been a while. It's funny because I used to be the youngest person at every conference I went to, and the last few years I've noticed I'm not anymore, and that kind of hurts a little bit. Makes me a little sad inside.
I know the feeling.
When college students call you sir, that's when you know you're getting a little old.
Well, and I'll say to you too, you working at the Lincoln home in Gettysburg, you had the like early career that like undergrad me wanted. Like,
Oh, it was
and would still
fantastic.
want, honestly, but yes, undergrad me, like working at either one of those two sites, I think if you'd asked me what I want to do, those would have been number one, number two. I won't say in what
Yeah.
order.
Well, my time when I was so I did Lincoln Home, then Gettysburg, then I went back to Lincoln's Home
Mhm.
as a full ranger. So my second time at Lincoln's Home was honestly, I'd have to say probably the best job I've ever had. I loved every minute of it. And I worked there in the wintertime too, so we didn't have a lot of visitors. So if I'd maybe give one tour a day, and instead of the usual 15-20 minutes, I could give an hour.
Yeah.
And for the rest of the day, I would sit in the home, usually just on the front stairs there, and read books. And
Wow.
that was where I did my first writing was during that time. I read so much that I've always been a writer. I was an English major in college and a writing
Mhm.
major, but I've always loved history. And so one day I got smart. I'm like, I'm a pretty good writer, and yeah, I really love history. So maybe I should write about history. So I started. My first couple of articles were there about Lincoln as a poet, which had not really been done very much by that time. There was a couple in the 40s, but nothing else really about him writing poetry. So that was, and then the mystery of Little Eddie, which was solved recently, which I did not solve. So I'm still a little chafed about that one. But I'll give Sam Wheeler his credit because he did a good job figuring that one out.
Yeah, Sam Wheeler solved that in the Journal of the
Yep.
Abraham Lincoln Association. So
Yes, he did. That was a great thing. I'm a little jealous.
Um,
I didn't get it. It's one of those things where sometimes you read a book and you're like, man, I wish I wrote that. And so that article was one of them. I'm like, man, I wish I'd found that, but can't find everything, I guess. So
right. We well, we can get around to that story too, because that's a good story, but we should probably get to the book.
Yes.
Because you also sparked like 5 other things I wanted to ask you, but yeah, let's get on track. And let me say, we already have a question in from the folks watching, so please, everyone, just a reminder, to send in those questions. I will try to filter them into the conversation. But yeah, before we get into the specifics, let's talk a little bit about the book. And describe. So the book is a history of the history of Mary Lincoln. It's what some of us would call or what in the history field they call a historiography. Although I would argue it's more of it's kind of both. It's a annotated bibliography. It's a historiography, and works on Mary, you almost even want to call them a historiography because they're in all different genres. It's not just historians writing about her, right? So why don't you talk a little bit about the inspiration for the book and what were your goals with the book?
Well, I've been writing about Mary for so long now. I've done 5 books about her, and it's just endless, the stuff that I find that's never been found, never been used, or quoted improperly or cherry picked or whatever for the points certain writers want to make, even though they're not the correct interpretations of what they find. But I don't even remember how it started. At some point, I just started kind of realizing that there's like this handful of books and articles about Mary that everybody uses. And there's tons of other writing out there that nobody uses. So I just started kind of collecting them as, in a bibliographic form of just author, title, year, publisher. And then somewhere along I'm a big nerd, so I love doing the analytical bibliography is what we officially call it. I had so much fun, but I did that as an article first of, I don't remember, 100 and some titles. And basically what I wanted to do was give all the information, then a paragraph describing it. What's it about? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it correct? Is it incorrect? Basically, I just wanted to help people navigate the waters, because the waters of Mary Lincoln are treacherous for many reasons that I'm sure we'll get into. The biggest reason being William Herndon, of course. But really, it's also just her reputation and legacy through the years. But I did that first article and I just had a blast, and I found so many books and articles and poems and plays and things like that I had never heard of. So I did that, and I'm like, as I'm doing my other books and things, I'm always keeping my eyes out. And then I kept finding more and more and more. So I did a part 2. And then, then I tried to get that as an appendix in the back of one of my books, and my publisher said, no way. So I'm like, okay, fine. Well, then I'll make it its own thing. How about that? So so that's when I decided, I'm like, okay, I'm going to look at basically everything about Mary ever and kind of create this guide. And so I did that, and that was going to be it. But then as I did it, I realized more and more what I was finding about her, what I was not finding about her. And so then, half of this book is an essay called The Common Canon of Mary Lincoln, in which I talk about my realization of, there's been so I look at over 400 works about Mary, nonfiction books and articles, but also fiction, poetry, music, theater. But of the 300 plus nonfiction books and articles about Mary, in my opinion, the common canon of Mary has become, there's only 7 works that everybody uses. And they keep going back to those same 7. All of them are old. All of them are outdated. Some of them have incorrect facts. Some of them they're not incorrect, but they have very badly formed interpretations based on their writer's own political agenda. Now, if you want to be generous, I'd throw in a couple other articles and things and say, maybe there's 15 works that everybody uses about Mary. And by everybody, I mean, not just historians, but, general writers who, people write for the Atlantic or the New Yorker. They're not historians. They whip off something about Mary and they use other people's works to cobble it together. Book reviewers, people who write plays or who write poetry. And they all keep going back to these same works. And so, my point of my essay is, okay, here's the common canon. Here's what they are. Here's what they say. Here's why they're good or bad. And you know what? Here's what's missing. And so I also give a list of a whole bunch of works that I feel are imperative people to read to understand who Mary was. And I tell why. Just kind of, basically I'm trying to lay out a new roadwork, a new framework for understanding Mary. People have been asking me for 5 or 10 years now that I should write my own biography of Mary. And I've toyed with the idea, but I don't know. I've written so much about her. I don't know that I want to go there. I might, but part of this is like, other people can do it. I've talked to a few people. One of the biggest holes in all of Mary scholarship is that nobody has ever gone to Europe to investigate Mary's 7 years there. Even scholars, one in particular, who was in Europe when she wrote her book on Mary, she didn't even research Mary in the European archives, which was a travesty. So I've actually talked to a couple of scholars who are going to Europe. One is actually there now doing this research on Mary that is long overdue. So, I won't take credit for it, but I'm just happy that they're doing it. So, so it's, I'm hoping that more people, because very few people actually investigate Mary's life either. So I'm kind of hoping more people do that. Everybody looks at Abraham's life, which is a great thing. But if you really want to understand a man, especially in that time, you have to understand who his wife is, especially someone he was with for over 20 years, had 4 kids with, went from poor nothing to the president, and she was there the whole time. I mean, you cannot truly understand Abraham by ignoring his wife or by just pushing her aside as she was some crazy harpy or she was, the other side of it. Oh my God, she was Hillary Clinton and he was a moron, which is ridiculous. But a lot of people think that too. So, I'm just trying to bring Mary up into the present and get more people excited about her. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's fine. And I'm going to ask you another question you're going to have a hard time answering succinctly. But that's the heart of biography, is to treat these historical figures like complex people, because that's what we all are. But
right.
I mean, if you can say this, I mean, Abraham and Mary are both exceptionally complex
Yes.
people, which is part of the reason why we're so fascinated about by them. And in Mary's case, having I was a latecomer to Springfield. I've only been here a little less than a decade now, and I was only kind of vaguely aware before I got here of all the controversy in Mary's historiography. And Mary's historiography has a lot of twists and turns, more than a lot of other people. So this is probably an unfair question to ask you to answer quickly, but I mean, most of our viewers probably know a little about Mary. They probably know some of those controversies, but can you just give a quick version of the history of Mary? Because it really is a fascinating story. Yeah.
Right. Mary was, fascinating. When Lincoln got nominated for president, newspapers just wanted to know not only about him, but about her as the wife and the homemaker and the future first lady. Everybody loved her. And then once she got in the White House and became first lady, everybody really started to hate her for multiple reasons, mainly because of her own bad behavior. Not all of it because of that, but that was a big part of it. But then after the assassination, nobody cared about Mary. They cared about the president who was dead. And so for those years, Mary was just pilloried by the press, by the Congress, by the general public. People didn't like her for multiple reasons. One of the big ones was, Abraham Lincoln's, his value at his death was over $100,000. And Mary was going around saying that she was destitute and poor. And, that's more than most people back then would ever even dream of seeing in their lifetime. And then she tried to sell her old clothes, the old clothes scandal, which back then, of course, so improper and embarrassing. Now, after Mary's death, most people didn't like her, even in Springfield. The people of Springfield really didn't like her. But of course, at her funeral, everybody came out about how much they loved her. After Mary's death, she was basically ignored. If she was mentioned at all, she was, Lincoln's wife. She was the little woman by his side who kept his home and raised his kids. Once you get to the late 19th century, she started becoming Mrs. Abraham Lincoln a little bit more, the president's partner, confidant, a little bit more of her own person, but still Mrs. Abraham Lincoln. Once you get to the 20th century, she started becoming Mrs. Abraham Lincoln in more of the kind of the June Cleaver sense of she was her own woman, but she also helped her husband into greatness. By the time of the 80s, which was when feminist revisionism was a big aspect of history, that's when Jean Baker's book, Mary Todd Lincoln, a biography, came out. And that's when Mary became Mary Todd Lincoln. She never used her maiden name ever. That really came about because of Jean Baker's book, quite frankly. And ever since then, Mary has been more of a feminist icon. By about 2000 or so, that's when she became an uber feminist icon, and she kind of became Hillary Clinton 150 years too soon. She wrote Lincoln's speeches. She gave him his thoughts. She told him to emancipate the slaves, and he was a stupid bumpkin, and Mary was the brains behind him. And so, I'd like to think now things are evening out a little bit as far as, because Mary was not that, and she was also not a worthless side character, as is always the case. She was somewhere in the middle. And I think, with more research and books and articles and scholarship, I'd like to think that people are beginning to see that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, because Mary, Mary is definitely the June Cleaver version of Mary was certainly an oversimplification too. Mary was exceptionally well educated. She was very articulate. That's partially what endeared Abraham to her, right? Is that he was kind of, the way I try to tell it anyway, and you can tell me I'm wrong, but the way I try to tell it anyway when I give museum tours and like that is that, that he kind of, he was really enamored of her because, Lincoln, who's kind of craving this kind of, who an intellectual life, meets this very intellectual woman, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, they had so much in common. And, I've always told people, it's funny, a lot of people think that I'm a misogynist or I hate Mary or something, because the title of my first book was called The Madness of Mary Lincoln, which a lot of people get offended by, but they don't realize it was marketing. It's a good title, But I think that the Lincolns loved each other very much. And I think they were a perfect combination. They balanced each other perfectly. Now, no marriage is perfect. And of course, the Lincolns in Springfield were 180 degrees different than the Lincolns in Washington. The Lincolns in Washington were not happy, but there's the White House and the war and publicity and press and Mary spending too much money. And, those are two completely different sides of their marriage. But at the end, shortly before Lincoln died, when the war was over, Mary said in that last carriage ride, he said, "We have both been very miserable. We both must be happier." Mm-hmm. And he wanted to travel with her and move with her. Well, he wanted to move back to Springfield. She wanted to move to Chicago. But, I think if Lincoln had lived, when they lived wherever they ended up living, they would have come back to that more harmonious marriage that they had before Washington. But I mean, there's ups and downs. They had a lot of downs that, a lot of writers focus on that for various reasons. But there was more to their marriage than just that.
Yeah, I mean, she's a unique, she's definitely a unique and complicated person. Elizabeth Keckley has that quote, right? "I never in my life," I'm going to read it here, that's why I'm looking down. "I never in my life saw a more peculiarly constituted woman. Search the world over and you will not find her counterpart." I mean, that's a pretty strong, but from someone who knew her well and who had had a complicated relationship with her.
Exactly.
Before we dive into Mary a little more too, talk a little bit, you have a very kind of personal connection with Mary Lincoln and sources and historiography. Can you tell a little bit of that story with the letters?
The letters? Yeah. Yeah, that was, so, when I was back in my younger days, when I was just a stripling, I was writing articles and I became fascinated by Robert Lincoln, which I wrote a biography of him called Giant in the Shadows, The Life of Robert T. Lincoln, came out a few years ago. That book took me nearly 10 years between the research and the writing and everything. So I was doing research on Robert at his house, Hildene in Vermont. And I found letters that led me to other letters. It's a long story, but they ended up I found a steamer trunk in an attic that was owned by the children of Robert Lincoln's attorney. And in the trunk were hundreds, maybe thousands of Lincoln family documents, mostly from Robert and his children, but there were others. But in the trunk was what have been called Mary's lost insanity letters that she wrote when she was in Bellevue Place Sanitarium in 1875 that historians have been looking for over 80 years when I found them. And so I found them in 2005. And actually, I don't think the museum has yet changed the Ghosts of the Library thing, have you? Which says, one day maybe somebody will find the letters.
The lost.
Well, what's funny was...
comment.
Well, after I found those letters, I went to Springfield. I don't remember why. I think I was doing research, and I was sitting in the Ghosts of the Library, and it said that statement, and I'm sitting there. I'm like, oh, I found them. But I can't tell anybody yet. But yeah, so that was every historian's dream: find a trunk in an attic full of lost documents pertaining to the family of Abraham Lincoln. So, but honestly too. But besides those, one reason I write about Mary and about Robert, the oldest son, is because they have both been overlooked and neglected. Abraham Lincoln's fascinating. I love him, but obviously he's still, I think, the third most written about person in world history. So it's difficult to find something new and unknown about him. You can make new interpretations, but finding new things is difficult. But with Mary and Robert, every day when I was doing research or my writing, I would find new sources, new stories, new facts, new documents that had never been used by anybody, never been quoted, never been seen. I mean, when I was doing research on Robert, one day I found a 15-page handwritten letter that Robert wrote, which detailed minute by minute everything that happened from the minute President Garfield got shot for the next week in the White House. Because Robert was there when he got shot, and Robert never left the White House. And no one had ever, to this day, no one has ever used that letter except for my book. Even every book about Garfield, nobody uses that letter. And it's stuff you can't find anywhere else. Yeah. So things like that, So this is why I'm fascinated by the Lincoln family, because they are their own people, but there are so many insights into Abraham Lincoln, his presidency, his life, that you find, Robert Lincoln throughout his life, he wrote hundreds or probably thousands of letters, and he talks about his father all the time. There was a great quote I found once where he said, someone asked him about his father's love of reading, and Robert said, I cannot say too much about his love of reading. In fact, I don't think I have a memory of him where he did not have a book in his hand. That's just, we all know that Lincoln reads, but to hear that from his son,
that's it, right?
It's amazing. So that's why, research, who is it? I'm forgetting her name. Wonderful historian who wrote The Mists of Avalon and among other books. I'm sorry, but she said research is endlessly seductive and writing is hard work.
Yeah.
That's absolutely, I love research and finding these new things. So
yeah, it's one of the things we pride ourselves on at the library, is that we have, probably the largest collection of Lincoln family stuff, and we try, that's one of the things I get to do. One of the fun things I get to do is I get to be the person. I don't have final say, but I get to pick. I get to start the process of what's going to go on display at any given time in our cases. And I always try to feature Mary stuff, but also family stuff. We try to put out, because we have those letters from Willie and Tad. We've got some cool Robert stuff. I put in they just came off display, but we have a great letter when Robert goes to Harvard. He sends a bunch of pictures of himself back to a girl he knew here in Springfield and tells her to share them with these other girls. It's like, I feel like it's Robert sliding into the DMs of these girls that he used to know, right? So I love it. It's great because you get to see them like, Robert's just acting like a kid who's gone to college, right? Like, you humanize them that way, right? So,
it's so funny. And Robert was, before his father's murder, one of the many things I learned about him was that he was hilarious. He loved to tell jokes, and he told stories just as well as his father did. Nobody knows that. But then his father was murdered, and then he dropped his entire life to go live with his mother in Chicago. And so after that, only the closest of his closest friends knew that side of him. The rest of the public and even acquaintances didn't know that about him. And it was all because of his father's murder. But things like that you can find when you actually go to the letters. That's one of my biggest pet peeves of when I read history books, is that when people don't go to the archives, they just grab other books and take stuff out of those books, and they might cite the original source, but they're citing the source from the other person's book rather than actually. And I can't tell you how many times I've found a great quote in somebody's book. I'm like, man, that is incredible. And then I go to the archive and I look it up, and it is not what is purported in that book. I can't tell you how many times people will take it out of context, will cherry pick it, will cut a phrase in half to make the point they want. But if you read the whole letter, the letter actually says the complete opposite of what a writer will use. So that's why you always have to go to the sources. I never trust anything unless I look at it first, the original.
Right. And that was actually that was a good segue into the last question I wanted to make sure I asked you before we pull in some from the audience here is like, so that phenomenon that you just described, where you find these facts that have gone, facts that you call them, that go from they go from historian to historian, and the historians are just either all citing the same other historian or they're citing back to each other. And then when you get to the end of the line, you find out there's no primary source there, that the primary source is problematic, right?
Right. Exactly.
And that happens a lot in Civil War history in general. But it's much similar to what I said about Mary. I had never encountered anything like it until I started working with the Lincolns. There's all these facts out there. Right. So I wanted to ask you, what are a couple, if you want to highlight, what are a few of your favorite Mary Lincoln facts that seem to kind of have no real root or have a very problematic root? Give me a couple of examples.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, the worst one that is probably the most prevalent is that Mary Lincoln during the insanity trial in Chicago in 1875, that Mary was completely innocent, had nothing wrong with her. She was railroaded into court by her son, who was a bastard and wanted to steal her money. And he bribed the judge and the jury to find her guilty because he wanted to get rid of her, shut her up in a hospital, get rid of her, take her money. And that, I hope you don't mind, I'll say that comes from Jean Baker's book. And she has a footnote at the end of the paragraph. And if you look up the footnote, there's one source. And that one source, it's like a newspaper article that says something to the effect of, Mary Lincoln had a trial today. And that's it. Like, how do you get, she bribed the judge and the jury out of that? So everybody quotes her book for that, many facts, but that's the biggest one I can think of. And so many people to this day think that that's what happened, that Robert bribed the judge and the jury to find his mother guilty so he could steal her money. There is not one single shred of proof or basis of fact for that statement. And yet it has become fact nowadays. Mm-hmm. So, that's a big one. One of the other big ones that's pretty prevalent is, I mentioned before that Mary was Lincoln's closest advisor, that she wrote his speeches, that she proofed everything he did, that she came up with all of his great ideas. But there's no evidence, at least that I've ever seen, to support that. I mean, she was his wife. Of course, he talked to her and told her things. I'm sure he ran his speeches by her as anybody would do with their spouse. But to think of her as some kind of co-president is really, it's people looking at her life with the presentism of 21st century and thinking that that's what she should be. And that's not what she was. But I found a lot of interesting things, of little things that probably a lot of people wouldn't care about. But there's when Eddie died in 1850, there's a great quote that Abraham Lincoln, that Mary wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep, wouldn't change her clothes, wouldn't do anything. And Abraham Lincoln finally said, "Mother, stop, you must eat, for we must live for the rest of our children," and whatnot. And that was attributed to, everybody attributes that to Catherine Helm, I believe, who got it, who got it from Octavia Roberts. Yeah. But actually, Octavia Roberts, I found the original. It was a newspaper interview with one of Mary's sisters, but everybody attributes it to Octavia Roberts. Mm-hmm. So it's a true story. It was from one of Mary's sisters, but the facts of it and the direct quote itself is a little bit muddled through the years and all the tellings. But I found a lot of those, and I found a lot of things that people will take from. Catherine Clinton's book, she got it from Baker, who got it from Randall, who got it from W.A. Evans. And W.A. Evans, I still think his biography of Mary is the best one. But his sourcing is horrible, and he doesn't always say his sources. So he has these great things, but he doesn't always say the source. So everybody gets it from him. It may doesn't always clarify where he got it from. So there's a lot of things like that. One of my favorites was, I was doing research on Robert, Carl Sandburg. He wrote a story of Abraham Lincoln riding
Have we lost Jason?
In his carriage with Robert, riding through the Illinois. They would stop, and Abraham would tell Robert, "Go run out." And Robert ran out, and every single time there was a moment. And Sandburg had that. He has no sources. Never found that anywhere in my life. And then actually, after my Robert book came out, I found that was a letter that Robert Lincoln had written to Judd. I'm forgetting his name. His letters are out in California, and so that story actually comes directly from Robert Lincoln, that actually happened. But Carl Sandburg didn't cite where he got that from. So I was pretty excited when I found that.
Boy, Yeah, if I had a dime for every time somebody asked me about a Sandberg story,
Right.
and and I, so yeah, I feel your pain on that one.
Right.
Well, speaking of which, speaking of facts, yeah, let's start getting to some of these. And the first one, because we teased it earlier, we have had a few people ask us about the little Eddie story. So
Yeah.
can we go ahead and quickly tell the little Eddie story?
Absolutely. Yeah, so little Eddie, sorry, I accidentally just minimized my screen here. Okay. So,
Oh, that's okay.
the Lincoln's son Eddie died when he was 4 years old. And shortly after he was buried, there was a poem printed in the Springfield newspaper called Little Eddie. And it was, about the death of someone's son, but the poem was unsigned. And so for decades, Lincoln scholars had wondered who wrote the poem, because obviously it was about Eddie. And then the last line of the poem was also written on Eddie's tombstone. So that seemed a clear connection to whoever wrote the poem was one of his parents, because they put that on the tombstone. And so there have been many theories that Abraham Lincoln wrote it because he actually wrote poetry. He was an excellent writer, as we all know. Some people say, well, Mary wrote it because it was more of a motherly writing. Some people say, yes, well, Mary could not handle grief. There's no way she wouldn't even eat when he died. There's no way she would sit and compose a poem. So obviously Abraham wrote it. And so I wrote an article about that. Actually, it was my second article I ever did. And Wayne Temple, whom I didn't know at the time, my supervisor at Lincoln Home said, call up Doc, he can help you out with this. So I said, I'm thinking about this. I was 19. I was terrified to talk to this big Lincoln scholar. And if anybody knows
Legend.
Doc, he's the sweetest man in the world.
Yeah.
And he said, what you should do? He said, write your article and just say, Lincoln could have written it, here's why. Mary could have, here's why. Someone else could have, here's why. And leave it open for interpretation, which is what I did. But my thought was, I thought Abraham Lincoln wrote it, because there's no way Mary could have done it. Plus, she wasn't that good of a writer, quite frankly, that we're aware of. We know she wrote poetry, but none of her poetry exists anymore. Mm-hmm. So, but as we said, Sam Wheeler discovered, it's been a couple of years now, that it was written a couple of years before Eddie died by a woman, I believe, in St. Louis.
Yeah, didn't he find it in a St. Louis newspaper? Isn't that the story? Or am I getting that right?
Yeah, I believe he was just combing through newspapers, just looking, trying to find it. And so it was an already established poem that probably multiple people had used when a loved one died, and the Lincolns clearly, or one of their close friends, had that printed in the paper in honor of little Eddie, but they did not write it. So yeah, that was a big find, because everyone was convinced one of the Lincolns wrote it. We just never thought we'd know who did it.
Yeah. If you're interested in that story, I used to edit this for the audience. I know Jason knows this. I used to edit the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. I wasn't the editor when Sam's article appeared, but the journal, one of the great things with the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association is its back catalog is entirely free and open access online. So you can, if you Google Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, it'll come up. There's a little search window, and if you put in, Sam Wheeler or Little Eddie or something like that, it'll come up. And you can read that article. But speaking of poetry,
my name,
Jason, go ahead.
Let me just say, if you put in my name, you won't get
Yes.
anything, because Christian never printed any of my articles when he was, but I'm just saying.
You never submitted any articles to me when I was editor. But speaking of poetry, poetry plays a big role in the Mary Lincoln story. Poets writing about Mary, and you have a whole other book on Mary Lincoln and poetry. So we'll talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, it's actually one of my favorites. It's called Lincoln's Lover, Mary Lincoln and Poetry. That I've always been fascinated by poetry. I used to write it a lot back again in my younger days. My first two articles about Abraham were about the poetry he wrote. And so again, I don't know where I got this idea from, but somewhere along the line, I found a couple of poems about Mary Lincoln. And I just thought they were really interesting. And there's multiple books of poetry about Abraham Lincoln. I have them all back there on the shelf somewhere. And it's like every, the 50-year anniversary of his death, 75, 100, 125, someone comes out with a new collection of poems. And but somewhere along the line, I thought, this is really interesting. There's a couple here about Mary that were fascinating. So I decided to go on a hunt and see how many I could find. And I found quite a few, obviously enough to make a book out of it. But, I've always thought that poets were fascinating because poets were, especially back then in the 19th century, they were the celebrities of the day. They spoke at weddings and funerals, and they spoke at births, and they spoke at great events, and they were celebrities. And when they wrote a poem about something, it was important. And so, I just decided to see what I could find. And I found poems about Mary from, well, first there's the one Riding on a Dray, which was written about her when she was a young woman before she was married to Abraham Lincoln, that one of her, the members of her social set in Springfield wrote about her. So that was 1839, I believe. And then after that, there was a couple written about her in 1865 as the widow of Lincoln. And then I found that the poetry about Mary took the same trajectory as her reputation of, there were poems after the turn of the century that saw her as more of the Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, June Cleaver kind of loving wife and mother person. And then when you get to about the 1990s or so, maybe even 1980s, almost everything written about Mary in poetry is always about the insanity case and her mental illness. So it's fascinating to see how these things change. And what I loved about doing this book was that, so I found the poems, and then I would write a little intro to the poem, the poet, who that person was, why they wrote the poem. And there was some fascinating stuff. I found one of the poems in here was written by the only person to ever publish a book of poetry while he was a slave. And this man was illiterate, actually, and he composed all of his poems in his head. And he lived in North Carolina in a college town in Raleigh. And so he would sit outside the college and he would write poems for the students, and they would pay him for it. And his master allowed him to do that instead of working in the fields. That was how this slave brought in money. And so he composed his first book all in his head. He told it to a white woman, who wrote it down and got it published for him. And then, of course, his master took the proceeds. But and it's a wonderful poem. And so, there's a woman who was bedridden and ill, and she had that disease where her bones were so brittle, like if she tried to get out of bed, her legs would shatter. And she wrote 3,000 poems and 10 books, and she won all these awards. I'd never even heard of her. And her poem was amazing. So there's all sorts of great stories of the poets as well as the poems. And then I think that you kind of get a look at Mary and her reputation through the centuries, through the eyes of the poets and how they see her and portray her as well.
Yeah, that's a good way to get at, we talk about the difference between memory and history, which we've talked about a few times in some of the other interviews we've done this series. And that's a good way to get at that is, how are the artistic fields dealing with this historical subject as opposed to the historians. I'm going to try to dig in some more of these questions. You mentioned Mary's insanity trial. We did have one person ask about Mary's medical records. Do we have any medical records from Mary? What exactly do we know about Mary's health? Which I've never been, again, around a historical figure where their health came up as much as probably Mary Lincoln, except maybe Abraham too, right? The two of them, it's always about what mental or physical disease did they or didn't they have? So, so yeah, talk a little bit about Mary's health and what are the sources for that? Yeah,
absolutely. There's quite a few, although not professional as you would think. So Mary, a voluminous letter writer, she wrote about her personal health all the time. I think she was definitely somewhat of a hypochondriac, as was Robert. Also, all of his letters in later life always talking about his health. So we know a lot about Mary's health from her own letters. The insanity trial itself, there are no medical records per se because they didn't really keep them back then. The trial itself, was covered in every Chicago newspaper. And so they all printed the testimony, of which were multiple doctors, some of whom were Mary's doctors, some of whom had seen her a couple of times but were not her actual physicians, and a couple of them who didn't know her, but they had been told about her case and they just said, yes, she's crazy, basically. Now, when she went to Bellevue Place, the records of Bellevue Place still exist, and it's called the Daily Progress Report. And that was actually published in an article in the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society back in the 70s. And so basically, almost every day of Mary's time there for 4 months, the patient progress report, which was written by the nurse or by the doctor, writes about everything she did. You know, when she took a bath, she took a carriage ride, she came down for dinner, she wouldn't come for dinner, she refused to leave her room, she refused to do this or that. And, you know, there's one of the big canards of Mary's mental health is that she wasn't insane, she was addicted to drugs, and it was the drugs that did it. Well, there's no evidence of that at all. Yeah, it might be true, quite frankly, it might be true. But if you go by the evidence, there's no evidence of that. There's 4 mentions of medication in everything about Mary. And all it says, you know, there's one letter where she writes to her doctor and says, I would like 5 more powders because I took the 4 you gave me. Well, that doesn't say anything.
That's in our collection. That's at our library.
Exactly. Yeah. And we don't know what the powders were. We don't know how strong
No.
they were. Her doctor was homeopathics, which basically means he believed in, you know, 90% dilution of medication with water. So whatever it was, she was mixing it with water. So, you know, Mary did try to commit suicide. So we know she tried to get certain medications, which she didn't get. Elizabeth Keckley wrote once about Mary taking certain medications, but again, we don't know how much or what it was. You know, there's no evidence of it. So, but one thing a physician pointed out to me that I didn't recognize was that in the daily patient progress reports of Bellevue Place, there is not a single mention of medication. Mary didn't ask for any, she didn't receive any, she didn't want any, and she did not suffer withdrawal symptoms. So if she was addicted to medication, as they say, there would be mentions of withdrawal symptoms for the medication she was not getting. There's nothing in those reports at all about medicine. So that's pretty fascinating. Now, when you get, you know, Mary was released from the asylum 5 years later in 1880, she was in horrible physical condition. She came back from Europe to America, and she had received a pension years before. She was trying to get the pension increased. So she went to New York. 3 physicians examined her, and they sent their report of her medical condition to the Congress, at which it was also printed in full in the New York newspapers. And the whole point of it was, she's in horrible shape, give her more money. But this is an actual physical medical report of her conditions at that time. But it was all physical, you know, it wasn't her mental capacity at that time. But then, you know, some letters from Robert talk about his mother. There's a lot of letters from the insanity period. You know, a lot of people don't know one of my lesser known books. It's called Mary Lincoln's Insanity Case, a Documentary History. And in that book is every single piece of evidence I have ever found about Mary's insanity case, including newspaper reports, journals, letters, everything. And the reason I did that was because I get tired of arguing with people about it. So I said, you know what, you don't believe me. Here's all the evidence in this book. And so, you know, look at it and see for yourself. So everything I just talked about is all in there as far as her insanity case goes, and the 1880 medical reports as well.
I said your books are very useful, which as someone who works in a Lincoln Museum, I certainly appreciate. I lost my train of thought. I had a good question for you. Well, it'll come back to me. Let's talk about another aspect of Mary's background that people talk about a lot, which is the fact that another one of these, also kind of a myth about Mary, that she came from a slaveholding household, but was kind of an abolitionist maybe, and, you know, talk a little bit about Mary Lincoln's experience with slavery, her views on slavery. Did they change over time? You know, how do you feel about all that?
Yeah, I think that's another, you know, I mentioned before some of the holes in her biography that we as scholars need to fill. And one is her her beliefs and her connection to slavery and African Americans. Yes, she was raised in a slaveholding family, and she was raised by Mammy Sally. Her black mammy was the person who raised her, not her mother or her stepmother. Now, there are various letters through Mary's life. Probably one of the most famous was when they were in Springfield. She wrote a letter complaining about how the Irish girls, who were the girls for the Lincoln home, who helped her with laundry and cooking and all that, Mary couldn't keep one around. They all kept quitting on her. Obviously partially was because of the way she treated them. But partially, Mary never figured that out either. But she was complaining about the Irish, and she said, "Boy, I've told Mr. Lincoln if he ever dies, he will never catch me outside the bounds of a slave state." Basically meaning, black slaves are better workers. They're better than having free Irish women in your household. Right. Now, during the Civil War, Mary's, I think her opinions did change somewhat. I mean, Elizabeth Keckley, who was her dressmaker, was her confidant. One of the big things in my mind is a lot of people say that, Keckley was her best friend, and they were almost like partners in their lives here. And I do not think that's correct at all. I would not characterize Elizabeth Keckley as Mary's friend. I think Mary looked at her as Mammy Sally, basically. Keckley was there when Mary had a problem. She would tell Keckley about it. If she needed help, Keckley would be the one to help. But Mary did not treat her well because she did not think of her as an equal. She was her dressmaker. She was like her Mammy Sally. So, I don't think Mary ever thought black people were equal to white people throughout her entire life. Now, during the war, she gave money to Elizabeth Keckley started a relief fund for blacks, people who had come up from the South. Mary gave money to that. She supported that. She was as polite to Frederick Douglass as her husband was when he came to the White House. But, I don't know that Mary, I don't think I would call her an abolitionist. A lot of people did. Jane Grey Swisshelm, who was an abolitionist, she thought that when she came to the White House, she was going to find this horrible Kentucky slave owner in Mary Lincoln. And she said, instead I found a kindred spirit who was nothing like that. She doesn't explain why she felt that way, though, so I don't know what the explanation is. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done understanding Mary's thoughts on black people, slavery in general. I found one newspaper article, and Michael Burlingame has used this in his book as well, that somebody said that actually the Emancipation Proclamation was Mary's idea. It was not her husband's idea. Again, that's one newspaper article with no sourcing. So I don't believe that it's true, but that is a story that does the rounds as well. So I think it's a fascinating thing. And, the Todd home in Lexington is a wonderful place, and they give really good tours there, and they talk a lot about the slaves and the family dynamic and everything like that. So.
Well, and there's a context there, again, it's hard to thread this needle when you talk about the Lincolns, that both of them really, and I'm not suggesting that they both end up with this in the same place as far as their opinions of African Americans go, but both of them, the Washington, D.C. context matters, right? When they go to Washington, they end up in this community through Keckley and Douglass and these other people in their orbit of this like educated middle class African American community that's in Washington, right? Which obviously can't help but have some, if you think African Americans are mentally inferior or whatever, that has to have at least some impact on you, right? And so I think that influences them, but whether that, or I say you have to thread that needle, I don't know if that brings them up to believing completely in racial equality, right? I mean, there's a line there, and that's where the gray area is that you have to kind of sort out when you're writing about them and you're thinking about them.
Right.
Let's try and get a couple more questions in here before we run out of time. Francie, hi Francie. Francie's one of our volunteers who comes to all of our programs. Francie wants to hear more about the story of how the Lincoln tomb, Mary's involvement in the Lincoln tomb being in Springfield, which is a huge contribution.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, that's an amazing story. Yeah. After the assassination, everyone just assumed that Lincoln would go, his body would go to Springfield. And so, the minute the city fathers of Springfield heard about the assassination, they immediately met and started planning for a tomb. And they bought a plot of land called the Mather Plot, which is now the new state capital in Springfield, is where that was located. And they bought that. They started preparing the ground. They were going to build the tomb, build a huge monument over it. And that was going to be the centerpiece of Springfield. Now, the problem was they had all decided that and agreed upon it and voted on it and started raising money. And nobody asked Mary Lincoln about it, nor did they ask Robert Lincoln either. I mean, Mary was obviously the mother, but Robert, by the social mores of the time, was the head of the family because he was the oldest male at 22. But nobody asked the Lincolns about it. So Mary found out about it through the newspapers. And if you know anything about Mary, you can imagine how enraged she was about that. So she immediately telegraphed Springfield and said, no, stop all your planning. Nobody asked me. My husband will be buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery because he told me that's where he wanted to rest in peace after he passed away. So of course, everybody in Springfield was outraged. How dare she? Who is she to tell us where to bury her husband? It's when you read about this, it's unbelievable. And so, long story short, Mary, by that time, she was in Chicago. They sent a delegation to go talk to her, try to talk some sense into her, and Mary wouldn't talk to them. She wrote them letters and she said, listen, if my wishes aren't complied with, I will take my husband's body. I'll take him to Chicago. I'll put him in DC. There was a crypt for George Washington. It's actually still there under the US Capitol building. Yep. I'll put his body there. And so, again, everybody was furious, but they took a vote. And the vote passed by one vote to follow Mary's wishes. And so the body went to Oak Ridge instead, which I love because imagine that if they had voted against her, I have no doubt that Mary would have taken his body and taken him to Chicago. Yeah. Absolutely no doubt in my mind. But then, so that happened. Mary won. Then a few months later, again, she read about in the newspaper that the city fathers of Springfield had decided, okay, well, the body will be in Oak Ridge, but the monument to Lincoln will be on the Mather Plot downtown. And again, Mary was outraged because they didn't ask her, they didn't ask Robert. And so she sent them a letter and said, hey, listen, the monument goes with the body. And if you don't listen to me again, I'm taking the body again. And so they had this big fight. And if Mary won that one too. She had a number of important people on her side, but everybody in Springfield hated her for sticking her nose in their business. But, that's a great thing because the Lincoln Tomb is unbelievable. It's my favorite site in Springfield. And it's nice that it's a couple miles out. I mean, imagine if it was right downtown. So, I think Mary was, there's some great articles about that whole fight. And you can't help but admire Mary in the midst of her grief. And she couldn't handle grief, and yet she stood up and fought with these rich, powerful men in Springfield to get her way with where she knew her husband wanted to be buried.
Yeah, it's a good story, and it's a story where Mary is advocating. One of the things about Mary is she advocates for her husband's legacy. Right. She very much sees herself as the keeper of it. And I agree with you. I work at the museum, but I will say that the tomb is my favorite site in Springfield. It's in a perfect spot. It's a beautiful structure. And I've been to a few presidential grave sites. I'm sure you have too, and it's really a wonder. And that's Mary, so right. and Robert too, and then Robert really takes ownership of it after the attempt to steal Lincoln's body and everything too, right? So
yeah, absolutely. He paid for the reconstruction multiple times. The state really didn't want to do anything, and then after the robbery, which is a wonderful story in itself, which is all in my biography of him. But he, because of that, he's the one who had his father's body put in a steel cage buried under 30 feet of concrete so that he will never be dug up again. Because, before the concrete and after the body theft, Lincoln's coffin was opened, I don't remember, something like 6 times. Because every time they had to redo the tomb or move something around, everybody there was like, well, we better just look in the coffin. We just want to make sure he's there. The last time was in with the 19 teens, I believe. And they said, hey, he looked like Lincoln. He just had a little bit of green fungus on his face, but otherwise he looked the same. But yeah, Robert, I think he also got tired of everybody opening the coffin. I think is another reason he did that. And one thing I've always wondered, I have no evidence or proof of anything. Supposedly Mary is in the wall of the tomb with the kids. But when Mary died, Robert had her body put in the crypt, and then the very same night, the members of the Lincoln Guard of Honor, they went in there and they brought her coffin down into the catacombs of the tomb so that it could rest beside her husband, which was in a foot of dirt covered over with old lumber to hide it. Robert told them to do that. And every time the bodies were moved for whatever reason of reconstruction, Mary and Abraham were always kept together. That was Robert's direction. And so, I have no idea, but I often wonder, but I've never honestly looked into it, if, I have to wonder if Mary might be in that concrete tomb as well, and we just think she's in the wall. It would make sense to me, but, I don't think anybody's going to open the tomb and look, but but I could see that happening without a paper trail, because Robert, he was afraid that people would try to steal her body too, because she was the wife of Lincoln. So even their tumultuous relationship and a lot of the hardships she put him through, he always loved her deeply, and he looked out for her even in death as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place. You're the first. I've never heard that theory before, by the way. So now
really?
You got me thinking about it. But
I think it's very plausible. I really do.
I agree with you that it tracks. I'm not not ready to commit to buying into it yet, but it's plausible. Yes. Well, we have a lot more questions, so apologies to everyone who I didn't get to your questions. I think that's a good spot to end on, and we're basically at our time anyway. But Jason, thank you very much for this. This was I really enjoyed this. I hope everybody watching did too. And I really, again, want to put another plug in for Jason's work. If you're interested in Mary, if you're interested in Robert, the two most recent Mary books are great. The Robert biography is very great. Is great, and it's very useful. As I use these books at the museum all the time. So yeah, I'll give one last plug for you. And thank you so much for being on, Jason. This was fun.
Oh, my pleasure. This was a great time. Thanks so much for having me. And I have a website, jasonemerson.com. I haven't posted anything in a while, but it has my email on it. So if anybody wants to email me questions you didn't get to ask tonight, I'd be happy to answer them as soon as whenever I can. Be my pleasure. Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, gentlemen, Mary Lincoln is always a crowd favorite. And I think you probably just piqued our curiosity even a little bit more. There's always one question answered and two left unanswered. So you have to do your research. And I will share what Christian said. If you haven't bought Jason's book, please do so. Now's a great time to even buy it as a Christmas gift for someone who might be interested in learning more about that as well. Like he said, go to his website, jasonemerson.com, to learn more about him. Send him more questions if you have them. Tonight's presentation is recorded, and it'll be shared with you via email tomorrow, also on our Facebook page and our YouTube page. So you can check that out. We encourage you to send this to friends that you think might enjoy this. Share with them this. Speaking of membership, this is an exclusive benefit for you as a member, but now's also a great time to buy a gift membership for a friend who might also enjoy these type of programming. We have a lot of virtual programming coming up. Next week, we have Bob Davis as he portrays Frederick Douglass. And then in January, Christian will be back interviewing Dr. Peter Carmichael to discuss his book, The War of the Common Soldier. And then on the 26th of January, we have David Wiegers, and he is a photographer, and he studies a lot of Lincoln statues. So he will have a great visual presentation for us at that time. You can register for any of those at this time. And as always, as we close out the webinar, there'll be a short survey. Please take it. It does help us to know what you're looking for, how we can improve, and how we can just keep this going. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Sure.
It was
and the gift shop, Jamie. Give a plug to the gift shop too.
Yes, great point. We have a gift shop sale going on right now, 15% off. You online. You can check out using the discount code Lincoln15, and everybody gets 15% off. And it's now through December 13th. You can do curbside if you're local. So on December 15th will be the curbside pickup from noon to 5. And they're also offering free shipping for any order over $50. So that is a great time as well for gifts. So there's lots of gift ideas for you guys. So no shortage there. But again, buy Jason's books if you haven't done so already. I'm sure we probably have some of them in the shop as well. So check them out.
Usually
and again,
do.
Thank you, Jason. It was very interesting. We could go on
Thank
for another hour, I'm sure.
I would love to. Anytime you want me back, I'm happy to come back.
All
We'll
right.
continue
Well, I'll
the
take you up on
conversation.
We'll definitely
right.
have you back, and we'll look forward to having you in Springfield when it's safe again to do so. So
I cannot wait. I miss Springfield so much. So I hope I get to come back very soon if COVID ever lifts. So
it will. It will. Thank you guys so much, and everyone
Thank
have
you.
a good night. Thanks.
Thank you.